All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Masari's Unqualified Opinions. I'm Ryan Selkis at 2-Bit Idiots. Got another exciting episode today with Brian Brooks, who's the Chief Legal Officer at Coinbase. So he's going to reveal all of the mysteries to Coinbase's internal compliance operations. We're going to talk about basically everything except for what the token teams want to know is when they're going to get listed. So I'm going to try to keep Brian out of trouble, but we can at least talk at a very high level about some of the standards that Coinbase is helping to create, being the leading platform in the West. Certainly the blue chip brand when people think about U.S. and maybe Europe and even beyond that for crypto custody and trading. Brian, before we get into all that. It's a little bit cliched to start this way, but everybody has an origin story. And I feel like that context is so important for how people got to the industry in the first place. It kind of informs their philosophy. It informs exactly what they're doing day to day. And I'd love to start there with you, just helping our audience understand how you came to Coinbase. And before Coinbase, I assume you had to fall down the crypto rabbit hole as a precursor to getting engaged with Coinbase. What was that process like, and over what time frame did this transition happen for you?
Well, Ryan, first of all, thanks very much for having me. This is a great program you have, and it's exciting to connect with your listeners. I really appreciate being included. I think, on the origin story bit, rather than just giving you a reverse summary of my resume, I can really give you a deep origin story because I think kind of been destined for this for a long, long time. And so what I tell you is if you go back 15 years or more in my career, a lot of what I've done as a lawyer was sort of trying to figure out and fix what's broken with the financial system. And, there are several early things that I think kind of pointed me in this direction. So one example I think about is years and years ago, this had to be more than 15 years ago, I was on the board of a nonprofit called Appleseed. We had a program at Appleseed called the Financial Inclusion Program. And one of the things we were trying to solve at that time was the problem that something like 10 million Americans received their tax refunds in the form of a check from the government. And these people didn't have bank accounts. So in order to get their tax refund, they had to go to a check casher and pay fees that were 5 or 10% of the check amount just for the privilege of getting their own tax money back. And so we had a program at Appleseed where we worked with the IRS to aggregate a whole bunch of tax refunds together and then go to banks and say, look, you might not want to bank these people individually because, they don't have the minimum balance on an individual basis. But what if we gave you 1 million new accounts, each of which had $400 in it? Would you then waive the fees? And when we did that, there was a bank that was willing to do that. And we got the IRS to issue direct deposits into this bank and basically give these, and the bank then agreed to give these people debit cards and a free checking account. That really puzzled me, why a bank would not want the individual account holders, but was willing to have all of the account holders. It told me something about the way the banking system worked. The idea that many people are excluded from that kind of financial service that you and I take for granted. So that was an early insight of mine into there's something wrong here, that ought to be fixable. If you fast forward a few years, I had some really interesting experiences in the financial crisis. One of them was I had sort of a celebrity client at that time, Alan Greenspan, who was the immediate former chairman of the Federal Reserve, one of the longest serving Fed chairs ever. And he was called to testify before the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission to talk about what happened. And, was it his fault as Fed chair that he kept interest rates low for too long? He had a really interesting story about that, which was, no, actually, it's not that we kept rates low. We raised rates every quarter for 4 years before the financial crisis started. What it is that global capital markets had sufficiently changed that the Fed could no longer control mortgage rates, right? And that had to do with the fact that Chinese investors who, had come online and at scale right around that time were investing in American mortgage securities as a high-yielding but safe asset. And so that told me there was something else broken. The ability of regulators to control money flows wasn't what we thought it used to be. Then I left my law firm and I went with Stephen Mnuchin and Joseph Otting to buy a series of failed banks in Southern California, led by IndyMac Bank, one of the biggest bank failures in the crisis. And if you wanted to see something that was broken, IndyMac was a great example of what was wrong with concentration risk in finance. So my point is, I had a whole series of experiences over a long period of time that told me there's something wrong with the system. Can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Then fast forward to 2017 and 18, and a former colleague of mine had come to Coinbase as the chief financial officer, and she clued me into the idea that one of the things that might be wrong with the system was its focus on central intermediaries. That when you concentrate all money flows through a small number of large banks, you get all kinds of risks created. First of all, you get the risk that they will choose not to bank the little guy. That's the problem of the small checking account balance that I learned at Appleseed. And then
Mm-hmm.
second, you'll get them chasing profits in a way that concentrates risk in a small number of institutions, which means that when they fail big. And then you had this issue of global capital flows. This was kind of the Chinese issue that Alan Greenspan was talking about at the time. And her thesis was crypto may be the answer to these things. Crypto solves the problem of central intermediaries running our financial system, much the same way that email and other kinds of distributed communication technologies solved the problem of the post office back in the day. And that was an insight I had not thought of, but I did know what was broken. And so I came to Coinbase because I saw Coinbase as the platform company trying to bring to market all of these projects that are going to fix that. That's what I'm doing here.
You joined in mid to late 2018. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but it seemed like around that time was when Coinbase really started to broaden its support for non-Bitcoin, non-Ether, and Ethereum Classic and Bitcoin forked assets. I believe at that time there was only 5 supported assets, and now there
Correct.
are dozens that are supported on Coinbase Pro, which is formerly GDAX. Now with Coinbase Custody, a number are available via staking. How much of a role did you play in coming up with the rubric to list all of these assets? And how much of this was Balaji kind of driving on the technical side, or Brian, having a slight change in course? Because for a very long time, Coinbase had basically just stuck to the blue chips. And I'm curious what the inside baseball was on how this evolved, and how you kind of changed your internal processes to support the multitude of assets without just listing literally everything, right? So there's still some quality control, but much more assertive in terms of what got listed.
Yeah. Well, look, Ryan, that's a great question. And, I'd love to take credit for all of that, but the old line that success has 1,000 fathers, whereas failure is an orphan. So, I think there was definitely a team effort.
Might be too early to tell, but go on. Yeah.
Well, if you think listing more assets is success, then we've succeeded. And if you think it's more
go.
than that, then I guess the jury's out. But the truth is, there was a confluence of events that happened at that time, and I think I played a role, but obviously not the only role in that. So, we had a belief that Coinbase's mission here was to be token agnostic. So obviously we have a lot of people here who do believe Bitcoin is a unique asset that has a unique ability to kind of decentralize and kind of remove the inflationary characteristics, among other things, of fiat currencies, to depoliticize money, if you will. So we do believe in Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
But we also see ourselves as, kind of the New York Stock Exchange of crypto. And if you think about the role of an exchange, it's to allow markets to decide which things are the most valuable. And so, comparing Bitcoin to Tezos is a little bit like comparing Ford Motor Company stock to Apple computer stock. I mean, they don't really have a lot to do with each other, but the market may want them both. And it's important that the capital markets make it possible for people to vote with their feet or with their pocketbook.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a philosophy that was going on at the time that I got here. And when I first walked in the door, my day one mandate was to figure out a way to crack the securities laws in such a way that we could list more assets. Now, we never want to list an asset we're not legally allowed to trade. And so, as you know, one of the big gating questions on that is which of these things are regulated securities and which of them aren't. So Balaji wanted to list a lot of things. Brian wanted to unlock the platform potential of the company. But as the gatekeeper of legal compliance, I had to figure out, how do we separate the securities from the non-securities? And so we noodled on that for quite a little while when I first got here, but we came up with, if not absolute clarity, we came up with a scale that allows us to sort of say, hey, we kind of can tell that there's a group of tokens clustered over here that may not be exactly like Bitcoin, but they really don't look anything like an equity security. And then there's a group of tokens over here that more or less look like somebody's just selling equity in a going concern, and those things we're not legally allowed to trade at the moment. So this became the genesis of what later was launched as the Crypto Rating Council, which is an industry-wide consortium that uses a framework to bucket these tokens into one of those two categories, or at least distribute them with what that is. We started using that framework, I would say 9 months or more before the Crypto Rating Council came into being. But the story of that is that we wanted to be a more relevant market participant. We saw some market share bleeding offshore because there wasn't a U.S. exchange to trade some of these things, and we were comfortable enough with compliance. We did carefully consult with government actors to make sure they knew what we were doing every step of the way, and I think that was part of our secret sauce. I don't want to suggest that any government actor, SEC or otherwise, has endorsed our framework, but we've talked to them in detail about it, and it's been gratifying to hear some people in the government start to use our vernacular of, well, that's a 4 token. That might be a little bit too risky, but this is a 3.5 token. That's totally fine. And that language has now, I think, started to get some traction in the industry. As soon as we saw that, obviously, our view was, look, this is Silicon Valley. We believe in open sourcing, so we don't need to own this process. It's probably better for the industry to have a common language for compliance. And that's why we created the CRC, was to make this available to anybody who wants to use it. But you're right. As a result of that scale, we were suddenly able to say, hey, it may be that we can't list 100 tokens, but there are probably 50 tokens we can list. Let's go find those. And that's what we did.
This is, I think, maybe one of the most important issues that's confronting the West, just from a practical standpoint. Yes, even the best regulated, most polished entities would like to abide by existing law and regulatory structures, but there comes a point where you have to forge ahead and basically ask for forgiveness before permission, which is a really loaded phrase that I'm sure you might push back on when it comes to financial services. But you do have to toe the line and be much more assertive if the alternative is losing most of your market share to offshore entities. And this isn't like gambling. It's not like other markets that have been cracked down upon within the U.S., because clearly some of these assets have been de facto blessed because the regulators have allowed various services to emerge and trade assets as long as they have KYC AML policies and money transmitter licenses, et cetera. The gray area is really what for a while was strangling U.S. companies and hurting U.S. market share. And this was the obvious issue with Poloniex as well, and how they slowly bled out was having to deal with some of these challenges. At what point did you feel comfortable with the rubric for CRC, and was this something that you rolled out internally at first before open sourcing, or what was the path as you did diligence on some of these networks, and then ultimately shared your work, or ultimately opened up the rubric for public comment with, or maybe not public comment, but semi-public comment with a group of like-minded Western entities?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I would say that process had 3 basic phases. So there was kind of a construction phase where, we weren't sure we could make this thing repeatable. And the worry we always had was, hey, all this is ever going to be is a subjective, tool that expresses somebody's opinion about whether this is a good asset or a bad asset. So the way that we tested it in the construction phase is we would build a version of the framework, which now has something like 36 questions, each of which has a weighting attached to it and everything. But in the early days, we would take the framework and we would farm our file on a given token out to 3 different outside law firms, and we would say, hey, run this scorecard, come back to us, and tell you what score you got. Is this a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? And in the earliest iterations of this, what we got back was random noise. Some people used the framework and thought it was a 1, meaning it's like Bitcoin. Other people said they thought it was like a 4, meaning not definitively security, but a lot riskier. Some people came up with other things. And so we had to keep iterating and going back to the drawing board until eventually we got to a place where all 3 of the firms had come back and they'd get the same score. And once we had a repeatable process and we were comfortable that any 2 people who were running the scorecard on a given asset would agree that it is whatever number it is, that's when we thought it's now ready for us to consider using. Now, you can make judgments about where your cutoff should be. Do you think the 4 is safe enough that you can list a 4, or do you only want to list 3s and below? Different people make judgments. But on the factual question of what are the characteristics, we got to a repeatable place. that's when we realized what we had was kind of like the Motion Picture Association, right? Like you
Mhm.
might or might not you might not like this particular R-rated movie, but you know that the R rating connotes very specific things. There's a certain amount of
Mhm.
violence, certain amount of nudity. That's what defines an R-rated movie, right? So once we all agree, you can then choose your assets or choose your movies based on your own preference, but at least you know what's happening.
Are
So
you guys PG-13 now, or is it are you listing R-rated movies? Because that's what people really want to know.
yeah, well, what I would say is mostly we have PG-13s. We have a handful of high-end Oscar-worthy R-rated movies, which I'm happy to talk about. Actually, I mean, it's an interesting question of how do you think about these projects
Hmm.
that are not securities, but they're kind of at the frontier, and they might pose more risk of inquiry and interest on the government's part. So I'll come back to
Hmm.
that in a second. But let me just go back to phase two of all this. So we constructed it. We got to a repeatable process, which was a fairly big innovation, I think. And then what we started doing was, as we would list new assets, we would talk to our principal regulators, mainly the New York financial services people and the SEC. And what we would do before we listed a token is we would walk in with our scorecard. And we said, hey, great news. We have this new tool out there, which is kind of cutting edge. This is how we're thinking about it. And, we got some feedback, and it wasn't like an endorsement. No government person said this, we bless this.
Hmm.
But what the reaction we did get was, okay, we like that you have a way of thinking about it, that you're not just listing any old thing, right? Process is everything if you're the government. And so we went by ourselves in this middle phase, and we used our own proprietary scorecard to list another 6 or 8 tokens. This was kind of back in early 2019 is when we were doing that. And once we had gotten over the line of the first set of assets that weren't the original 5, we got some muscle memory around this. We felt pretty good about it. And then I was talking to Brian one day, and remember, I come out of financial services, not tech. So this open source idea is kind of a new idea to me.
Hmm.
But Brian and the tech leadership of Coinbase are all about open source. That's what Silicon Valley is all about. And at some point, he and I were talking, and the question was, should we open this up to credible other players or not? And we decided that it's better for Coinbase that the crypto ecosystem flourish than it is for Coinbase to hoard its one good idea and use it as like a patented, technology.
Hmm.
That's the way that markets develop. And so at that point, we reached out to the biggest U.S. exchanges and we invited them to join. We also reached out to some of the most important asset managers, custodians, people who have an interest in the ecosystem. We purposely didn't reach out to project developers because they're the ones getting rated. So there's a conflict of interest in that. But our
Hmm.
feeling was, for the rest of us, we're like the movie theaters. We're not making the movies. We don't get to rate our own movies, but it is important that all the theaters signal to the world which ones are the PG-13s, which ones are the Rs. And that's kind of where we got to.
And I think one criticism, I don't know if it's just the noise of Twitter or if anyone really credible has come to you with this. I certainly think that some entrepreneurs have called it out. Um, how do you ensure that those players contributing to these ratings are not also conflicted, right? Because you, as an exchange, if you're competing with offshore entities that are listing everything and you're losing market share, the general bias is going to be to rate things 4 and below, right? To make sure that an R rating is actually a PG-13, that a PG-13 is actually a PG, and maybe the reverse of grade inflation, right? So lowering the, or no, I guess it'd be like grade inflation, right? You're lowering the bar to
We got to
make it
cheapen
easier
the A,
for.
so there are more A's. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's kind of two components here. There's what steps did you consider or take to avoid that initially, and then how do you make it more robust over time so that that system doesn't degrade if you run into a situation where, okay, Coinbase can credibly trade 30 assets, but now the market wants 500. So you still go into the same market share issues that you had a year and a half ago before you started listing more assets.
Yeah. Well, what I'd say is there's several protections against that. So one is, at Coinbase, we still periodically go into the SEC and we say, hey, we're just keeping you updated. These are the assets we're listing and here are the scores. And we do periodically go and say, and by the way, here are the really high rated assets that we're not listing, right? So we wouldn't be able to do that if it was a whitewash. We'd be crazy to walk into the government and say, hey,
Mm-hmm.
we've given a whitewash to all of these sketchy assets, because they would be the first ones to call us on that. So that part's a good discipline. It's also good discipline in that these ratings have to be consensus ratings across all of the CRC consortium members. So this is another reason we thought it was important to kind of open source this, is if
Mm-hmm.
Coinbase was doing it alone, you could imagine that criticism being plausible, right? Any one company has a strong interest in sort of listing more assets than the other guy. But once you have a majority of the market inside the system, I can't outflank my competitors at Bittrex or Kraken or whoever else is in this consortium on a given day, and so there's a little bit of self-policing that goes on there. And then finally, we recognize that for this thing to be credible, with some tokens have to flunk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Flunk is probably the wrong word, but they have to be a regulated token and not an unregulated token. So, it's in our strong interest to be able to show, hey, we got some 4.5s and some 5s, and those are generally outside of our risk tolerance at Coinbase.
Mm-hmm.
If we couldn't do that, nobody would buy it. So, we have a strong interest in our own credibility. The one other thing I'd say, though, and maybe we talk a little bit more about this as we go along, is we believe at Coinbase that being a security does not mean you're illegal. It just
Mm-hmm.
means that you have to trade on an exchange. And we've been working hard for the last 6 months to get our broker dealer, which we have, the appropriate authorizations to actually trade security tokens. So we envision a world one day where it doesn't much matter whether you're a 5 or a 3. If you're a 3, we'll list you on our trading platform, and if you're a 5, we'll list you on our ATS, which
Mm-hmm.
will be a regulated environment for these things to trade. The idea that security has become synonymous with illegal in the space is a little bit crazy.
Well, it's illegal to trade on secondary markets.
Well,
That I think is,
outside of an exchange, right? Totally legal to
yes.
trade securities on
Mm-hmm.
a secondary market inside of an exchange. So where we need to get
Mm-hmm.
the regulators to, Ryan, is a place where they understand that a security token is no more illegal than IBM stock, right? IBM stock's also a security, and people happily trade it on the secondary market every single day at the New York Stock Exchange. So the trick is
Would
getting the
all,
government to allow that.
sure, but would all of the same systems still work if you wanted to withdraw or send to the securities token exchange as you would to the Coinbase Pro exchange? Because my understanding is you're going to have different restrictions on inflows and outflows for the ATS than you would otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit overblown, to be honest. I mean, I think people speculate that might be the case because there isn't yet a place where this occurs. But if you think about the way that equity securities trade on a the kind of exchange we're all familiar with,
Mm-hmm.
it's relatively seamless customer experience. What happens is you have an exchange, NASDAQ or the NYSE. You have a custodian, which is typically your broker dealer, and then you have a broker, which is the same. So you go to Charles Schwab and you trade this stuff. There's no issue putting in market orders and for liquid books immediately getting a match. I mean, because really all
Mm-hmm.
an exchange is a matching engine that is able to clear. And so in the case of crypto, the one nuance is that the SEC has made clear they want the custodian and clearing entity to be separate from the broker dealer. But that's fine. We've all established trust companies in various states that will be our clearing agent and custodian, separate from our broker dealer. No reason
Mm-hmm.
that we can't use technology on the back end to make all of that super simple. So at least for security tokens that are highly liquid, this should be the same as buying and selling Bitcoin. The customer experience really shouldn't be any different.
Um, Point taken. I guess there's only so much that we can talk about there because we haven't seen it yet. So I
Right.
want to go
I'll
back.
just forecast for your listeners, you may see it sooner than you think.
Ooh, that's about as spicy a take as you get out of anyone from Coinbase when it comes to
Uh-huh.
pre-announcing an announcement.
I'm not pre-announcing anything. I'm just making a forecast. They should pay careful attention.
Good. So I want to go back to you use the term open source, or at least that's within the ethos of the industry. So you want to broaden the accessibility of this. In practice, though, how is the CRC functioning? Because I was under the impression that the ratings council was engaging a firm to do these analyses and kind of monitoring over time. Is that opened up to different law firms as well, or is this just kind of a shared pool of capital, almost like a collective nonprofit or SRO, where you've got dues-paying members that are paying for the same services? How does the sausage get made, or what can you share about how the sausage gets made when it comes to actually studying these projects and then filling out the rubric?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this. So in the early days, as I say, we worked with multiple law firms, largely as a validator. So we wanted
Hmm.
multiple smart people looking at this away from each other to come back and tell us if they could replicate the results.
Yep.
Once we got to that place, you're right. We've now principally started using one law firm. It happens to be the law firm that's worked with the largest number of exchanges, so they just have a lot of baseline information about these tokens. So their learning
Hmm.
curve for any given token is relatively flatter than some other firms.
Yep.
So what happens is this: the CRC members have a voting process to prioritize which assets the CRC is going to look at next. Okay, and
Hmm.
so all of the dues-paying members get a say in like what's your next top five, and we stack rank those based on the number of votes they get, and we push those through the system. What happens then is we gather up all of the publicly available information that's available about a given token. And if there is a known project developer, we reach out to the project developer and ask them to give us whatever information they think is relevant to this, right? We don't always get responses to that, which is interesting. I mean, there's some people who, either believe that their token is so decentralized that even though they originated it, they're not really the manager of it. So, there are examples of that I won't name by name. But generally speaking, the project developers will send us the white paper. They'll send us various other things. We intake information from Reddit groups and all kinds of other public source information, and we package that up and we feed it to the outside law firm who initially runs the scorecard.
Hmm.
The law firm then comes back to the council with a recommended rating and the filled out scorecard. Council members, especially the ones who voted for it, typically have run the scorecard themselves, as sort of as an internal check. And so the
Hmm.
discussion at the CRC meetings is, okay, the law firm thinks this is a 4. What does everybody else think? And my experience is that about 80% of the time, everybody agrees with that. We've kind of looked at it, and this is objective enough. We pretty much all know what the outcome is. But 15 or 20% of the time, there's some kind of meaningful disagreement. Typically, it's
Hmm.
because some member has a piece of information that the law firm didn't have, right? And so that person says, hey, here's the information. We feed that back in and we rerun it until we get to a place where there's a consensus. And that process has resulted in some tokens getting rated with a lower score, meaning a better score. And in other cases, it's resulted in us taking a relatively low score and making it higher because of some unknown piece of information.
Hmm.
But only at the end of that process does the CRC take a vote, and we record these votes. And when we have a vote, then the thing gets rated and the rating is put up on the website and it's there. Now, I'll tell you, in a future state, relatively soon, I think in the next couple of months, I would say, we're going to go ahead and publish the full scorecard so that people can see how that really works. There's
Hmm.
obviously been interest in all of that, and for various reasons, we didn't want to launch it with that because we didn't want to have a bunch of public back and forth about could question 17 have been phrased this way versus that way. We wanted people to
Yep.
see a volume of things to understand.
Hmm.
But that's the basic idea. It's a consensus mechanism. There's a law firm that starts it, but they don't decide. They merely administer and run the numbers for us, and then we come back and we vote as a group as to what we want to adopt. Very
Um,
similar to the Motion Picture Association. Actually, that's very similar to how their process is.
Got it. So you mentioned there are some Oscar-worthy R-rated movies, and that you will support and list. So I guess the Oscar-worthy best alternative currency nominees, at least in Coinbase's nominee form, would be XRP, Tezos, and Maker, because they are rated for 3.5 or 4.5 even. Is that consistent? Are some of your decisions then impacted by liquidity of the tokens, where you will push and say, even though this is a 4, we kind of have to list it, and here's why. And what is the process for engagement at the gray area, and how do you toe the line when you go into these conversations with regulators and try to understand just whether they will allow you to continue to trade 4s versus say, you know what, this is a great system, but something has to be a 3 or below, right?
Yeah.
And now the D becomes the F.
Right. Well, so first of all, I want to distinguish for the listeners between taking factors like liquidity into consideration for purposes of determining what the rating is, which we never
Mm-hmm.
do. In other words,
Okay.
just because something's liquid does not mean a 4 becomes a 3.5.
Yep.
We have no fear or favor in terms of the ratings. But then there is the question of, when are you willing to list a 4? So I'll tell you, at Coinbase, generally speaking, we haven't listed anything above a 4. you mentioned Maker, which at one time rated higher than that, but then there were some changes and some developments that led the CRC to relook at that. And so there's a predictive rating that tells us that upon the achievement of certain things, that rating is going to be lower than that. And so that's what got us there. But there's no current 4.5 that we would list at Coinbase. I'm not saying that could never occur, but it hasn't occurred yet. There are some
actually, now that I'm looking at it, I don't see Maker currently listed, and it is still at 4.5. So maybe that's consistent.
Yeah, there's right. So without predicting the future, I'll just tell you that, as Bill Hinman, director of corporation finance at the SEC, has said, the nature of these things changes as decentralization and utility are built out. And so from our perspective, the legality of listing something on a given day depends on that. So there are some things that initially were 4.5s or 5s, and upon a re-review over time will be more like a 4 or something else. And so that'll matter. And I'm not saying that Maker is a particular example of that, but it could be. Bottom line is for the 4s, that's kind of our definition of an R-rated movie. Meaning some of those 4s are best picture candidates for whatever reason. It could be because they're deeply liquid. It could be because they're playing a critical role in the development of some aspect of crypto that we believe as a technology matter is really, really important for the world. It could be that it's got some role in solving education in the developing world, or world hunger, or climate change, or something like that. And so we do take those things into account in deciding which 4s to list. Having said that, like any responsible company, we have a risk appetite, and we don't want to concentrate all of our business in 4-rated tokens, because even though we think 4s are not securities, right? That's why they're not 5s. We recognize that 4s are going to get more scrutiny and attention, and it is possible that we'll have to defend some of those more than 3s. And thus, we only want to be in a position of having to defend those things that have really clearly articulable value add for our customers. That's really where we're making decisions at that frontier. Below 4, we readily list. As anything that's 3.75 and below, we're fully comfortable going with.
Right now, CRC has 25 different assets that have been rated. Is that just what's been publicly announced? I'd have to imagine there's a whole slate of assets behind that have either been evaluated and deemed 5s, or that have been evaluated and just not publicized for some reason.
Yeah, so there are 2 categories of things that you don't see on the CRC website. First, there's just a pipeline of things, right? So it may be that we've got some preliminary ratings, but the council hasn't taken a vote yet. Or, in other cases, as you say, there will be some 5s. So the threshold for us publishing a rating is we're not looking to defame projects. So we're not looking to say, hey, this thing's a 5, danger, Will Robinson, the world needs to know it's a 5. That's not our business. The point is, we're only publishing the ratings of tokens that one or more members lists, right? So it's sort of like with the movies. You can't go to your local Lowe's theater and find the rating of a movie that's not showing. They're only showing you the ratings of what's on that night. That's kind of our philosophy as well. So there are 5s, a number of 5s, and a number of 4.5s and 4.75s too. Because nobody's listing those, we don't publish those. We have disclosed that list to regulators when they've asked for it, so that they can see the transparency of the process. But we're not, publishing that to the world for obvious reasons.
This is the famous Hinman test. How does something, go from a security into an asset that no longer trades as if it's a security?
Right.
How sticky are these ratings then? Because there's a historical component where it doesn't matter how much time has passed, the way that you conducted the token sale was the way that you conducted the token sale. So that might always be a black mark for a given project under the CRC rating system. But there is certainly a path for many of those metrics that you're grading against for a project to come into the light or gradually go from a 5 to a 4.5 and then a 4 and then a 3. But and I know you said you're going to open this up for public consumption. How much of the initial rating is definitive versus subject to change based on new data and information that comes in from one of these networks?
Yeah. So first of all, I'd make a distinction between the legality of us at Coinbase or any trading platform listing an asset for secondary trading versus the legal obligations of the issuer based on the sale of the token, right? And I think if you look at some of these SEC enforcement actions, what you'll see is the manner of the sanction or at least in some cases what's been discussed with them, is the idea that the issuance was the issuance of an unregistered security, which is the violation of law and imposes on the issuer certain obligations,
Hmm.
versus the current trading of that asset on a trading platform is potentially no longer unlawful because that asset no longer has the characteristics of a security. So, for example, if Coinbase wasn't part of the ICO and didn't do any of the distribution, and that was 3 years ago, and now the token has achieved full utility and the network is fully operational, et cetera, we would regard that very likely as something we could legally trade here, notwithstanding the fact that the issuer might have had some obligations based on their original sale, which was away from us and happened long ago.
Hmm.
In terms of how the CRC looks at this, there's a little bit of case by case to this, but one of the factors, but it's only one factor among 36 or whatever the number is, was the thing sold primarily for investment purposes, right? Now, we have some thoughts about different ways that project developers could think about initial sales of tokens, and I'm happy to talk about that. But bottom line is, if the sale was far enough in the past, if the token is sufficiently decentralized and or has sufficient utility today, that may not result in it being rated very high on the scale. It maybe that one negative factor is outweighed by more developments that have decentralized or given it utility.
Got it. Um, the how often do the ratings change? Are they revisited regularly, or is it event driven? What's the impetus to revisit prior rating?
Yeah, so the answer is both, actually. So aspirationally, what the CRC intends to do, and obviously this is still a relatively new initiative, only having been around 3 or 4 months, but the discussion has been that roughly once every 6 months we would re-review assets that were previously reviewed, and that's just to give us some discipline to make sure that we're capturing whatever is relevant over time. We don't
Hmm.
always necessarily know for any given project what's happening, so it's good to take a relook. But there's also some event-driven issues. So, for example, if you look at the DAI token, which was originally launched as an Ethereum-backed stablecoin, and then all of a sudden there was a significant change in the project. The idea being we're going to back it with a basket of other crypto assets. Well, that's a whole different question, and we need to relook at that. It's just fundamentally a different asset at that point.
Hmm.
So too, if you take things like XRP, which we list obviously, but when XRP did their MoneyGram deal and suddenly had real global distribution and a significantly different utility case than it might have, 2 years ago, say, that's relevant to our assessment of its utility. And so, some of its events driven. We may read something in the newspaper that will cause us to go back on a more urgent basis, and if not, we'll capture it as part of the periodic cycle.
Got it. We've talked, quite a bit about the CRC and just the listing process in general. Maybe because it's one of the biggest black boxes in the industry, and maybe the most relevant for people that are focused outside of just the casual observer. Right, your general exposure to crypto is predominantly going to be Bitcoin first, maybe Ether first, and then everything else.
Yep.
But for listeners of this podcast in particular, I find they tend to be folks that are a little bit further down the rabbit hole and have a multi-asset portfolio right now, which is consistent with some of the customer base that Coinbase now has. I want to switch gears though and talk about a totally different aspect of your legal focus, which is on privacy. And exactly what the line may be when it comes to FATF regulations and different standards for tracking customer behavior on withdrawals and potential use of mixing services or privacy tokens, et cetera, because this has become a major issue on some of the Asian exchanges. Coinbase, Gemini have been notable exceptions to privacy coin support. Kraken, same thing, and supporting Zcash in particular. At the same time, you're starting to see more anecdotes, not just from the Western exchanges, but in general, of customer accounts being flagged or even removed if a withdrawal is made to a mixing service or a shielded address or is otherwise hard to track and then report back to the relevant authorities. Can you help people understand what the hell's going on and like what could potentially get them into trouble, or how you're thinking about this from a fungibility standpoint and customer support standpoint, particularly since we seem to be in a bit of transition period.
Yeah, well, so there's
and let's,
a lot.
Let's define FATF first, and we'll kind of work backwards from there.
I was going to say there's a number of questions embedded in that question. So if you start with FATF, for your listeners who don't know what that is, FATF is a treaty organization of multiple countries, basically dedicated to fighting money laundering and terrorism financing globally. And so FATF comes up with policy recommendations for its member countries. It's then up to the member countries to decide whether and how to implement those recommendations pursuant to the group's kind of charter and organizing documents. The most important thing FATF has done in the last year, obviously, is clarify the application of something called the travel rule to crypto. And the travel rule is something which, when applied in the banking system, basically says that every time a wire transfer happens from bank A to bank B, the wire has to include all of the upstream send receive information. So who did it originally come from? And this is how you know that a wire from Mr. Smith to Mr. Jones, in New York actually originated in Iran, as you can tell that there was first the move from Iran to France, and then from France to London, and then from London to New York. That's how you know that works. This is a challenge in crypto, obviously, because the point of crypto is to be a decentralized mechanism of exchange. And so a lot of crypto is not focused on institution to institution transfers. And as a result, a lot of the crypto universe has been focused on what would it even look like for blockchain transactions to have some clunky wire transfer type of identifying information on it, A. And B, a majority of crypto transactions are not exchange to exchange. They're either exchange to private wallet or private wallet to private wallet. So how do you think about those things? The position we've taken is, we're not going to try and quibble with what the law is. I mean, we're a company whose entire brand is about compliance and being the trusted, safe place to do this. So if the governments of the Western world and parts of Asia are demanding that there be compliance, we'll figure it out. The debate right now seems to be between solutions like we're trying to build that are sort of crypto first solutions. In other words, blockchain based travel rule compliance solutions, versus other solutions that are much more what I would think of as traditional finance, the application of a new software layer totally away from the blockchain that would require exchanges to, maintain their crypto business over here and then turn over here and log something in some system of record on a Microsoft platform or something crazy like that. We've done a fairly good job thus far of bringing some of the major US exchanges along with us for the crypto first solution, so that at least the utility of crypto is retained in a travel rule world, but it's not obvious that that will win. And so we're in detailed dialogue, I mean, even literally this week, with FinCEN and Treasury leadership to talk about how we're going to comply. We can totally build something. We can definitely do this, but it needs to be something that is native to the blockchain and not something that imposes bank-like requirements on us. Because if we're going to do that, you don't need crypto. You might as well just use Swift at that point. So I think that's the important thing to know there. The only other thing I would say is, what do we do about wallet transactions, right, that are not that are off exchange? And what we've sort of said about that is, look, we can only control what we control, so that discussion is not about us. But as a policy matter, the data shows criminal and fraudulent crypto transactions are quite small as a percentage of total transactions, and are indeed significantly smaller than criminal and fraudulent bank transactions. And so our basic view is, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We will comply, but anything that says, hey, wallet transactions are bad, that's kind of like saying Google ought to be responsible for whatever is sent through Gmail. Nobody thinks that. And that's what crypto is a platform for people to do what people are going to do financially.
Will large withdrawals above a certain threshold trigger an automatic suspicious activity report if you can identify that it's going to a mixing service or a shielded address?
I think on the mixing service, I think that is still something that we're analyzing, and I'm not sure that there's a clear answer on that. I mean, these are important issues, and we're going to continue to doodle on those kinds of things. In terms of shielded addresses, what I would say is there are two different things going on. There are shielded addresses, which raise one set of issues we can talk about, And then there are addresses that have been identified over time as associated with some sort of illegal activity. So,
Mm-hmm.
there's certain kinds of gambling establishments where it's not currently lawful for U.S. persons to send or receive money from. There's certain addresses that are associated with specially designated nationals on the OFAC list that we're not
Mm-hmm.
allowed to transact with. And so over time, I think the way this probably plays out is a combination of industry and government will eventually build a list of banned addresses that just have to be blocked. Certainly, a lot of the stablecoin issuers have already built, if you want to call them blacklists of addresses that are known bad guys. If you know someone's an Al Qaeda member, you simply blacklist that address and you build those addresses up over time.
Mm-hmm.
Shielded addresses are different, right? I mean, shield addresses sometimes are shielded for the protection of the person who's receiving the money because they're a dissident in Cuba or they're a freedom fighter, in some oppressed country, or they're the opposition in Venezuela. And one of the things that I've been very clear in a lot of speeches I've given is we need to recognize that while there is obviously a really important priority in fighting terrorism and fighting money laundering, there's also an important value in protecting freedom in parts of the world where we take it for granted, but they don't, right? And where that balance is something that policymakers have to decide, but it's not like the only use of this stuff is for bad guys. That's not even the predominant use. And so personally, I think that we need to have a nuanced approach to privacy tokens in general and shielded assets or shielded addresses with that in mind. Don't want to downplay the law enforcement angle. That's hugely important, but there are other dimensions of human activity as well. So that's what I would say. These things are complicated.
I think that all makes sense. The one caveat that I'd ask about for basically most of the addresses, the issues that you've addressed so far, how different is Coinbase international engagement from the home engagement, right? The domestic U.S. engagement, because it strikes me that with most of your personnel, most of the assets under management, in the U.S., even if things are allowed internationally in some of the jurisdictions that you operate, just from a systems and compliance check and cohesion standpoint, maybe the international affiliates are abiding by U.S. rules, potentially to their detriment, by the way, just for simplicity and consistency across the customer base. Is that accurate, or and maybe there's some nuance here, but generally speaking, is that the approach, or are you a little bit more aggressive in certain international jurisdictions that might have lighter standards? It could be when it comes to privacy. It could be when it comes to whether something is considered a security in the U.S. Or across any of the metrics that we've talked about.
Yeah, well, so the watchword generally is that we want to comply with the local law of the jurisdiction where we're our entity is acting, and so Coinbase Inc., which is our U.S. not ultimate parent company, but sort of main operating company, does business around the world in various ways, and then we have foreign subsidiaries that have pieces of the business. What we expect we likely will do, likely this year, is stand up a more independent operating subsidiary, likely in Singapore, but someplace that
Mm-hmm.
will allow us to serve parts of the world where they have a fundamentally different regulatory philosophy from the U.S. So right now, we operate here and in Western Europe. We have a license application pending Japan, but our principal business is the U.S. and Europe. Europe is not that different from the U.S. in its regulation of payments instruments, securities, in its adoption of money laundering rules. They're all, all the European countries are FATF members, et cetera. So what I tell you is it's not like we have a place right now where the law is that different that would allow us more operating leverage. What we do think is there are parts of the world that, have a different approach to all of these issues. In order for us to not have U.S. law exported to our activities in those places, we have to stand up an entity that is sufficiently independent. It's managed independently. The matching engine is separate. The technology stack is independent, so that business doesn't touch the U.S. We are very, very cognizant of the fact that anytime there's a U.S. person involved in a trade or in management or whatever, that's going to be subject to U.S. law. So to serve some of the things you're talking about, to incubate some of these technologies in places where they're needed, and not have US law, which has a whole different set of assumptions behind it, apply to that transaction. We've got to stand up those entities, which we're working on.
Brian, what do you think the most misunderstood thing about Coinbase may be to the broader public? Because I think everybody has their own opinions. The casual observer sees Coinbase as the blue chip brand, and then there are going to be a bunch of proponents and naysayers along the way. But from the criticisms that you've seen, whether it's on the legal side or product support side, what do you think people don't get about either your team's role in the giant apparatus or the company more generally?
Well, look, I'm going to pick two things, okay? Two really misunderstood things about Coinbase, which might or might not be based on criticisms, but they're just things I think people don't get.
Mm-hmm.
So one is, it's always gratifying when I roll into any U.S. audience and I'm the guy from Coinbase, and the respect we get, the admiration we get for our size and our scale and our early kind of implementation of this stuff is really awesome. What I think people misunderstand is, Coinbase makes a lot of money. Coinbase is really big. They're the dominant platform. So the misunderstanding is we're always going to be here. What I would tell you is the regulatory environment around this stuff is so fragile that there could be a world where Coinbase isn't here. And we shouldn't take this stuff for granted. So as an industry, I think sort of how Coinbase goes, so goes the nation. We can't necessarily support all of this by ourselves. We do need the industry to coalesce around some key principles having to do with securities compliance, law enforcement compliance. Every time there's a data breach or a theft or anything else, it impacts Coinbase's ability to be like the standard bearer for the US industry. So the first thing is, don't take us for granted. We're trying really hard over here, but we're only one company. So I'd start with that. And I think the second misunderstanding is people really see Coinbase today, I think, largely the same way they saw it 3 years ago, which is it's a place to buy and sell Bitcoin, right? It's the stock exchange for crypto. What we're working hard on every day here is to make crypto more valuable to people. I think what's going to distinguish Coinbase from the competition in the future is that we've built a series of value add services necessary for an overall crypto economy to arise. That's why we were one of the earliest and most robust adopters of staking. It's why we rolled out a margin product that's had enormous uptake in the last couple of weeks. It's why custody is really a huge focus for us so that institutions feel comfortable holding this asset. And, one of the reasons I came here was I saw the company as more than just a trading platform. I saw it as the platform company for all crypto technology. And that's why I say anytime anybody in crypto wins, Coinbase wins. We want to be the infrastructure player for people in this space.
Well, I would tend to agree with you. And I know that I, among many others, first got into the industry with Coinbase and purchased my first Bitcoin there. In fact, its emergence and backing from Fred Wilson was one of the reasons that I was able to get over the hump psychologically and make the leap, as I'm sure is true for many others. So, Brian, thanks for demystifying some of the inner workings of Coinbase. We'll be keeping close tabs on the CRC, and of course, Messari is, as a company, generally swimming in those same waters on the self-regulatory side without being officially a self-regulatory body. So I'm sure there's much more to do there. And we'll look forward to having an updated conversation when the ever-changing world has completely shifted in maybe a couple of weeks or sometime later in the year or next year.
Fantastic. Well, Ryan, thanks very much for having me. It's a real pleasure. This is a great work you're doing here.
Thank you very much. And to everybody watching, listening, subscribe, share with your friends and coworkers. Until next time, peace.